Okay.
I got
Yeah, and while Tim's getting ready, you can introduce it, Ethan, and kind of lay some of this out about what we're going to be going through and whatnot. Kind of give us a little extra time, I guess.
Yeah. I like to let them play for a minute.
Yeah, I like your opening, like with the fire.
Yeah, I did that like a few weeks ago. I took that video. I thought it was pretty cool. I did one today when we're hiking. I took a video of the lake. I might switch it out. There's a fire in the lake sometime. I want to play just a video of my dog because I know people would like it, but then it might be completely unrelated to the stream. So people might be confused. I don't know. Cool, we got 5 people in the stream. I don't know how many of those are us. One of them's me. But either way, it's a good start.
Anybody in the live chat? I know.
Yeah, that one person that fifth trumpet, but it looks like 6 people watching now, so.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm gonna start. If you guys want to mute or whatever, if you're doing something, that's fine.
Do I need to mute?
No, you're fine. There's no background noise. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Spartan Theology. I'm like 99.9% sure I'm not muted, but I say that every time, and I probably am. So if you can hear me in the chat, please let me know. Or if you can't, let me know. But I appreciate everybody for coming by. I see Fifth Trumpet was here pretty early. And Apocalypse here is in the chat. I'm sure that's John. And I appreciate you coming by. And anybody else I don't see yet. Like I said, I appreciate you coming by. Today's stream, pretty excited for. We've been planning this one for a little while. Really, Travis and Tim have been doing most of the planning, but it's pretty exciting. We should have a really good stream tonight. So they're going to be presenting. Their arguments are very closely related, but not exactly the same or anything. And they're going to be laying out their arguments, and then from there, it's just going to be like a free-flowing conversation. If you have questions in the chat, just leave them. We'll probably ask them as we go. I mean, we'll try and get to all of them by the end, but if they're related, we'll definitely ask them as we go, because this is really going to be like a free-flowing conversation. I think it's going to be really good, because I don't really... Oh, they heard us throughout the whole thing. Nice. When I thought you couldn't hear us, you could. But whatever. That's better than not being able to hear us when we were supposed to. But I think it's going to be pretty cool because I don't really know what their argument is necessarily. Like, I know a little bit. Obviously, we've been talking about it. But I think it'll help because I'll be able to kind of see where maybe they could clarify a little better for all the people in the audience to understand. But, yeah, I'm really excited for this one. I have a few streams planned too, so if you're not subscribed to the channel, I'd love for you to subscribe. We're going to be doing a stream. We're doing this one, and then on Monday, I'll be having John Depew with Apocalypse here. We're going to be talking about the way Paul uses the Old Testament in his letters, and we're going through a couple of they're called echoes in this book here that I've been reading. It's called Echoes of Scriptures in the Letters of Paul, written by Richard Hayes. And we're going to be going through like a few specific examples where Paul like cites the Old Testament, but it might not be the super clear ones, that you're always talking about. So I'm really excited for that one. We've been planning that for a little while, and that's gonna be a good one. And then other than that, on next, I think Wednesday or Thursday, I'm not exactly sure if we've nailed down the day, but I'm gonna be having Micah. I don't know his last name, but he's done a few streams with Joe Schmid. He has a channel called Crusade Against Ignorance. He's a agnostic or an atheist. I'm not sure exactly what he calls himself. But we should just be having like a chill conversation. He's super smart, knows a ton about philosophy and stuff. I think it'll be a really good conversation. So I'm excited for that one. But yeah, so with all that, all the intros out of the way, I think the way this is going to go is Travis is going to lay out his argument first. We'll kind of just, I'll ask a few clarifying questions as we go. If you guys have any questions in the chat, let us know. And yeah, if you could just kind of, I guess just go ahead and lay out your argument if you're ready, Travis, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so basically, I'm an idealist, and I'm going to be laying this out using both science and philosophy. So the latest research shows evidence that our brains use quantum information processing to function as a quantum computer. Studies in quantum gravity show that the universe could emerge from quantum information processing, and moreover, quantum entanglement is an essential feature of a successful theory of everything. Now, according to quantum pan-computationalism, or it's better known as digital physics, the universe functions as a quantum computer governed by a mind. Then we have things like the precision in the united force breaking into the four fundamental forces of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, which show that precise information was input at the time of the Big Bang to run a specific program for human beings who are disassociated alters of the prime consciousness. And then philosophically speaking, we have things like the universal applicability of mathematics, the ontology of the laws of logic, and of objective morality, which would be mental properties of the fundamental mind governing the universe. So the argument will go that information processing is the product of mind. The universe is emergent from information processing. Therefore, the universe is emergent from a mind, and this mind is who we call the fundamental mind, or God. That's sort of just like a basic outline.
Yeah. So this is basically, like you laid out, an argument for idealism pointing to God. And I think one thing that we've been talking about, and you could kind of mention, is some of the strengths of idealism as opposed to like a dualist perspective of the universe, wherever. Like,
right.
That's. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically, we can take this all the way back to quantum gravity. That it would be emergent, from information processing. So think of it like with substance dualism, you have, the two substances. But with idealism, it's just, think of it like everything can be boiled down to information processing. Like, like I gave the example of even the chair you're sitting on, it's made up of some subatomic particles that are performing functions governed by information processing. So there's only one substance, and that's information, which is a mental construct.
Okay. Yeah. And that seems so like almost sort of like an Occam's razor type thing, where the simpler explanation, as opposed to a dualist explanation, which is positing this two substances, where you're just positing one, which
here's an interesting thing that any argument you can make for dualism, you can make for idealism, and it's a more simple explanation.
Okay. Yeah. Which is definitely a bonus or an advantage to your explanation over, like I said, over a dualist explanation. I guess where would you see one of the tougher parts, or where were the places you think people may push back, where they're like somewhat warranted or whatever, and pushing back or whatever, and kind of how do you respond, or at least just a common objection? Maybe I know like an objection, a common one could probably be, well, that just sounds weird to think, that the whole universe is just made up of like a mental construct or whatever. But that's not. It's definitely not. I guess you could it's not the same as a simulation hypothesis, which is like when I first heard of idealism, that's definitely what I thought of. So kind of like, what's the difference maybe between what you're saying and like simulation theory?
Well, simulation theory, it would be like, from what I understand, like the universe would be like a giant computer. And then there's a problem with the number of electrons in the universe. Like, we know that's not the case. But this is like more on the quantized scale. And, going back to what you said about it sounding weird, 40 or 50 years ago, yes. But as we study quantum gravity, we're seeing that space-time is very likely could be emergent from this quantum information processing. And what's interesting is when we do studies in quantum cognition, and like, which is like how we map thought, or decision making and thought processes in the brain, it's the same type of properties that space-time is emergent from. So it would show that a mind, or the force that space-time is emergent from, has mental properties.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that totally. So, do you
And
think?
then bring philosophy into it, like like the laws of logic and things like that. It just to me seems very reasonable to infer that the universe is governed according to a fundamental mind.
Yeah, and Fifth Trumpet asked a question in the chat, and that's a good one too. What I was kind of getting at, he says, "Whose mental construct? Mine." And you're not presenting like a solipsistic view or
No,
anything like
no,
that. Like,
no. So we would be what's called disassociated alters of the prime consciousness. In other words, like we're our mental state is quantum, is entangled within a brain. So it's basically we would have the characteristics of the fundamental mind, not the reverse.
and on this theory, there still is an objective reality out there outside of our minds. There's not. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
like a mental.
It's not
Yeah,
solipsism. No, no.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not
Which is
our
yeah.
right.
I
We
think
would be related to the fundamental mind, not vice versa.
exactly. I think a lot of people want to go with, well, that sounds like everything's just like either a simulation or just made up, or just in
No.
our heads or whatever. And that's not what you're saying at all. Like, there is an objective reality out there. It's just
Right.
made up of mental experiences of a foundational mind, as opposed to
Right.
the
And you can
material
use
things.
the like I was saying, the ontology of the laws of logic. Like, what is the proposition that there were no humans alive before there were humans alive? I mean, you can use lot. I mean, we have like things like the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction. So it's not dependent on our minds. It's a fundamental mind.
Okay, nice. Yeah. And like I said, I'm sure as we go through, because Tim's argument is definitely related to this, and Tim has a PowerPoint that he's just wrapping up now. So whenever he's ready, we can show that. If you are ready, you can let me know. But he's just putting like the finishing touches, and you're muted right now. So, but you may want to be, but but yeah. So as we go through his argument, we'll obviously see a little more and kind of flesh this out more, and I'm sure it'll make a little more sense. If this is the first time you're hearing it, I guess, Travis, what you could do too is suggest like a few places people could go to learn more. I know we put some sources in the chat, but
Yeah.
they're probably some like more higher level things. And I know
Right.
like Inspiring Philosophy is definitely a great resource, but there's definitely others
Yeah,
too.
there's Kyle of he has a channel called Christian Idealism. I highly recommend. In fact, he has a foundation series that he's going through. I recommend you start at the beginning and watch that. And of course, Johann Ratz is he's the one that actually Inspiring Philosophy learned from, and that I've learned from. So he's kind of like the godfather of idealism. So and he has a channel I would definitely recommend checking out. And basically, Tim's going to be kind of getting into the biology and how it would correlate like down. I'm kind of starting at the top, like with quantum gravity and emergent space-time from information processing, which correlates to thought and mind, properties of thought and mind. And so Tim's going to be kind of taking it down to see how it goes down even like into biology and so forth.
Exactly. Yes. And no. What was I gonna say? I'm not sure. And like, yeah, it just makes sense. So it's kind of wild to think as I'm thinking this through, though. So you're saying like the ontology of like the laws of logic is essentially the same as.
Well, it's a mental construct, a property of the mind.
Just,
like
but
logic
so
is a
yeah,
mental
and
property.
so is objective reality is like the same. Fundamentally, down to the fundamental level, it is the same thing.
Right.
It's all one thing.
Right, and we see space-time emergent from this information processing, and it just it starts at the top and it goes down, and that we have we were given like the same type of mental properties, of information processing. So it's really a mental construct that the universe is emergent from, which would of course make it a foundational mind.
Do you think this plays like? How do you think about this in regards to like classical theism? I'm curious if maybe you haven't.
Oh, that's I would be labeled classical theist, but I'm a panentheist. So I see that God is both immanent and transcendent. So it's basically when you look at idealism, basically the universe, like it's like the thoughts or the mind of God.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I think when it comes to classical theism, yeah, go ahead.
Space-time is emergent from a more fundamental reality, and that will get into like a panentheism, a soft panentheism. Okay.
So God, is, like you said, he is transcendent, but also,
he's both immanent and
immanent. Yeah.
And he wouldn't be bound by spatial temporal dimensions. Like, if you're a Christian, you believe that the Holy Spirit lives within you, and simultaneously he lives within other people, and heaven. So he's not bound by spatial or temporal dimensions.
Yeah, as far as panentheism goes, is one thing. I just not sure how that relates to like, really a few of the like immutability or impassibility, like the fact that God can't change. Like clearly, if it's a panentheist perspective, like he would change as reality changes. But I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that's like a fundamental flaw or anything. Well, that's just a different.
No, well, I mean, he would be transcendent. He would transcend the dimensions that we exist in, but he would also interpenetrate it. So it's not that he's transcended and he also interpenetrates it. So no, I would still hold the immutability.
Okay, and I don't think, and this isn't like found. I'm sure this is like a secondary point of the argument or two. It's not based on panentheism. That's not where you start with your argument or anything like that.
Right.
Like this is just
Yeah, basically what I mean by that is that our reality is emergent from a more fundamental reality, which is the mind of God.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I don't know what happened to Tim. I think we might have lost him for a second, but I'm sure he's going to be here soon. He hasn't left, so. But I see we got John in the chat who said, "Glad to see Travis here. Glad he's been watching our videos too. Both of you."
Oh
rule.
yeah,
yes, we do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm looking forward to the string too about Paul in the Torah.
Yeah.
Because you kind of get a different interpretation of, and I don't want to go off topic, but you got to get a different interpretation of the Old Testament from Paul. Like he kind of, I don't know. So that'll be interesting to look at.
And John actually put out a video. I think it was today. He put it up about like he did a video on his channel. We're gonna be like somewhat expanding on it. The stream will be like a little more specific, but he put one up too about like Paul's view of scriptures and whatnot. So yeah, and that's like off topic, but that's fine. Yeah, I don't. This is just a conversation. So I'm fine with talking about whatever. But
I'm glad to be on here, not having to do a debate.
yeah, I know. It's nice to just have a conversation.
Yeah.
But the more I think about this, it's more like idealism is the type of thing for me that I just haven't looked into, and it's like it seems like a big pile of stuff I need to learn before I can really.
The most simplistic way to look at it is that everything in the universe can be boiled down to information processing. The universe is emergent from, and another thing is, like I was saying with digital physics or quantum pan-computationalism, is that all the subatomic particles in the universe, they're performing functions according to the information processing, and it's intelligible. I mean, and like I said, when the fundamental force broke into the forefront, like when the universe goes classical, about 13.79 billion years ago, we see that it had the precise information, like for electromagnetism, that has to be exactly like it is for molecules to bond together. So it's like everything is in fact, that's the way I define the fine tuning too. I think could be kind of tied into it. Is that we see the information is uploaded at the time of the Big Bang when it goes classical. Okay. And so that's the macro. Then when you get to the micro, all the subatomic, they're performing functions according to information processing. So it shows that the universe is emergent from and governed by a mind.
Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah, it totally makes sense. And I think we got Tim back, so he should be ready to do your PowerPoint, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Cool. Yeah, I'm pretty
Yeah, so
excited for this.
maybe Tim, like I was saying, I kind of started at the top with quantum gravity, emergent space time, digital physics, and then like I guess if you want to kind of expand from there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just present what I have, and then we can tie them in together at the end.
Cool.
Or when I'm done. How long have we been going for, Ethan?
It looks like like 15, 20 minutes or something. 20 minutes it looks like, but that.
All right, cool. I'm going to share my screen.
Yeah, I'll stick it up there as soon as I see it.
Hold up. I want to shoot.
Hold up. Wait.
What is going on?
Yeah, it looks like John's not a fan of your panentheism. He's freaking out in the chat. No, I'm just kidding. He's not.
All right. Do you see what I got?
Okay. God is both immanent and transcendent.
We got it.
Do you see that?
Yeah, we got it.
All right, cool. Well, awesome. So basically, I just kind of went with, is there teleology or design in biology? And this is really cool because since we're bringing forth arguments for a foundational mind, the data I'm going to be presenting is going to be one part empirical, and then I'm going to have some philosophical considerations. But this is the important question. So this will be kind of the argument structure. So the argument structure here is basically I'm going to go over the fine-tuned physical parameters, and I'm going to go over the physical determinants of living systems and biological form, which will include structuralism. And then I'll go over the natural genetic engineering functions, abbreviated NGE, this I'll be referring to it as. And then I'll go over the non-randomness in evolution, and then I'll go over some philosophical considerations. So those are the points I'm bringing to the stream today. So if we start with, I guess, the universe and its overall history, whatever the initial state was, either if it was at the inflationary era or at the pre-inflationary era, in which we would use quantum cosmology to investigate, either way, which I also think most plausibly there would still be an initial state with a beginning of that sort. There are some fundamental parameters in which are governing this initial state, and which govern the causal unfolding of the 13.77 or 13.78 billion years. The what? Oh, gotcha. That govern the 13.78 billion year causal unfolding or history of the universe. And it causally unfolds according to, well, the input at the initial state, like I said, whenever that was. So these things would include, like I mentioned, the fine-tuned physical parameters. And these would be, we have three categories of fine-tuned physical parameters. We have the laws of nature, the constants of nature, and of course, the initial conditions. So I put about 5 laws of nature here. We have the universal attractive force, such as gravity, forces like the strong nuclear force, which binds protons and neutrons together in the nucleus, which obviously you need to have cells. You have the force relevantly similar to the electromagnetic force, something similar to Bohr's quantization rule, and then you have the Pauli exclusion principle.
Yeah, hold on. I think the stream actually did freeze for some weird reason. It may be good. I don't know. It's like, hold on one second. It looks like it's frozen.
Well, this is perfect.
We could hear you the whole time, from what I could tell, and I think everybody could hear you, but it just froze for some reason. So
this is good though, because this kind of takes, how I was saying, like the precision in the fundamental forces, like shows information input, and this goes perfectly with it.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're gonna see a lot of overlap here. Ethan, is the stream good?
No, one second. I'm getting it.
Okay.
I don't know why, like everything. Oh, yeah, I don't know why. Hold on.
Were you able to hear mine, Tim?
Yeah, everything. And just look back. You could hear it the entire time. I just don't know. Yeah, it's like
no. I was asking if Tim could hear my argument.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm looking at your stream right now, and it's just showing a space background.
Yeah, now I took it off because like I lost, like everything
Oh, okay.
froze, but I don't know. There we go. Dun, dun, dun. Working on the fly, people.
I'll start at the beginning so they
Yeah.
can see the slides and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, this goes perfectly because when we're starting at the top, I mentioned how like we have the precision in the when the fundamental force breaks into the four fundamental forces, and how we need the precision in like electromagnetism to form molecules and everything. So it's kind of cool because it kind of takes it like where I started, and it kind of takes it from there.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I think we're good now.
We good?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
All right. I'll go ahead and kind of go to the beginning, I guess.
We definitely
So-
saw the whole first slide we saw. It was when you like, the reason I didn't notice is because when you switched like after the initial slide is when
Okay.
it froze. So yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So I'm good to go.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. So yeah, like I said, is there teleology, design, and biology, and then what are the implications of that? And I think the implications are a foundational mind. So this is the argument structure. I'm going over the fine-tuned physical parameters. I'll be going over the physical determinants of living systems in biological form, which will include structuralism. I'll be going over the natural genetic engineering functions, abbreviated NGE, and I'll go over the non-randomness and evolution, and then some philosophical considerations. So if we start, like I said, with the universe's overall history, there is an initial state in which the universe emerges from and starts from, and this initial state either is during the inflationary era or it's a pre-inflationary era in which we need quantum cosmology to investigate. Either way, there is an initial. I believe it's most plausible there still is an initial state implying a beginning of that sort. And from the initial state, there are fundamental parameters that govern how the universe's overall history will causally unfold. So the causal unfolding of the universe's history is predicated and dependent upon the factors present at the initial state. So what we have is fine-tuned physical parameters, and like I mentioned before, we have the laws of nature, the constants of nature, and the initial conditions. And these laws of nature include a universal attractive force such as gravity, a strong nuclear force, and these are the things that binds protons and neutrons together in the nucleus, which is what you need within cells. Force relevantly similar to the electromagnetic force, something similar to Bohr's quantization rule, and then the Pauli exclusion principle, which it has to do with things within quantum states. Then you have the constants of nature, and I just named just a few here. These just determine the basic structure of the universe. You have the gravitational constant, you have the cosmological constant, you have the fine structure constant, coupling, etc. And there's actually 26 main constants that you actually need to construct a universe, given the current physics that we understand. But physics agrees that there are about 26 fundamental constants that are governing the universe. And these are constants, so they don't change. And like I said, they're present at the get-go of the universe as it unfolds. And then you have the initial conditions, and the initial conditions are incredibly important because this includes the distribution of mass energy, mass density of the early universe, the Big Bang explosion strength, the strength of density of perturbations that lead to star formation, ratio of radiation density to the density of normal matter, and so on. And it just keeps going on and on and on. So what you should take away from this is that there are fundamental physical parameters that are govern how the universe will be, unfold, its structure, etc. And these are important because you need these fine-tuned physical parameters to be within, to have particular values or in a particular range to get a universe that can actually harbor and be life permitting, and actually lead to the evolution of complex life that leads to conscious moral agents of the sort that we are used to, like ourselves. So then we get into the physical determinants of living systems. And fine tuning is important because you have to have the fine tuning before you actually get into life itself. So you have the physical determinants of living systems in biological form. This gets into structuralism. So life is a stable, reproducible complexity, and it's dynamic in nature. There are many, many, many definitions of life, and some are more accurate than others, but there is no agreed upon single definition of accurate definition of what life is. It's actually really interesting that uh, it's something so close to us. It's something so imminent to us, but and intimate to us, but it is something hard to define in imprecise terms, because many things that we see within life, non-life also kind of behaves and proceeds in the same way. But it is a dynamic, stable, reproducible complexity. That's one thing that we can boil it down to. So biological entities obey the fundamental laws of physics. Now, life cannot totally be reduced down to just physics, but one thing we know about life is that life has to obey physics. It is still a law governed by physics. What you have is you have the static deterministic laws in place, which I mentioned in the fine tuning, and then what you have is a dynamical system, which is what life is. And so that's really interesting. So this gets into, well, how does life proceed? How does the evolution of life proceed? And this gets into structuralism, because structuralism affirms that life is the result of natural laws and not merely a byproduct of historical contingency. This is contrasting with functionalism, which is which has its birth in the neo-Darwinian slash modern synthesis of evolution, which basically states that life is basically a random walk through adaptive space. But structuralism says, hey, listen, no, life is actually not just that in the way it develops and evolves. It's actually the result of natural laws and not merely a byproduct of historical contingency. So there are physical determinants that are constraining internally and externally how life proceeds and how life develops and how life evolves, even prior to any selection and or heritable mechanisms in which we would be, which we understand in the Darwinian sense. So one thing to note is that we have thermodynamical processes that are involved in the origin of life, or abiogenesis. Now, we're still learning about the origin of life and abiogenesis, but what we know is that life and energy go hand in hand, that life bypasses entropy. It's involved in thermodynamical processes, but life is interesting that it can bypass, not violate, but bypass entropy and equilibrium. And it actually can use thermodynamical processes to bring about ever-increasing complexity, which is what biology is concerned with. It's concerned with ever-increasing complexity. So self-organization processes would be involved in abiogenesis and cellular development. Biologist Stuart Newman has a paper called Many Roads to Multicellularity, where he basically states and outlines that many of the roads to multicellularity are actually physical processes and non-genetic processes under any selection pressures. And so this is something that's well documented, and which gets us to the fact that, well, in the origin of life, in abiogenesis, no current biological selection pressures that we, are familiar with were actually present during the origin of life. So non-Darwinian processes would have been the contributing factor to the origin of life. And then this gets us into natural genetic engineering, NGE, which is really important. Right here we have Dr. James Shapiro, who has coined the term natural genetic engineering. And it basically refers to the functions that cells inherently have. And they are cellular genome editing functions. This is really important because cells have these inherent functions, mechanisms, and processes in which they utilize to actually bring about genetic variation. Contrast this with the conventional evolutionary thought of the modern synthesis in neo-Darwinism, that genetic variation and change to the genome primarily comes about through replication errors, accidents, and genome damage. But what Dr. James Shapiro has documented, quite well, and it's also affirmed um, in other articles and journals and by other biologists and geneticists, is that cells are able to read their genomes dynamically to adapt to changing conditions during cell reproduction and multicellular development. So we have to stop thinking about evolution as um, little isolated changes that happen. Descent with modification, it's static, and then a change happens, and then they pass that down to their descendants, and then that's how evolution proceeds. But actually, evolution is a 24/7, 365 process and it's full of processes and mechanisms, and very complex ones that are always running, and they're very dynamic. We have to remember that what our cells are primarily doing is in our systems, in our bodies, they're mainly maintaining homeostasis, and then in responses to stressors and certain situations, cells are constantly employing their genetic engineering functions to architect their genomes, to change their genomes to fit um, to come up with solutions and to fit whatever is suitable for that particular moment. And cells are constantly facing unpredictable contingencies, and I'll get into that in later slides. So in evolution, cells actively write data and formatting signals into their genomes by processes and mechanisms such as symbiogenesis, horizontal gene transfer, and of course, like I mentioned, natural genetic engineering. And this gets into something really fascinating, which is the read-write genome versus the read-only genome view. The read-write genome is what Dr. James Shapiro is advocating for, which is that really the genome is basically a dynamic information storage organelle. A common widespread view is that organisms are determined by their genes and by their genomes. But actually, DNA is actually not a very good replicator. And if you take DNA out and isolate it, let's say in a petri dish, and leave it alone, give it the nutrients that it needs, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to do anything fascinating at all. But when it is within a cell, the cell can use it as a information storage organelle, a dynamic one, and it can actually write its own genome. So instead of during the transcription and translation process, and the only changes come about through mutations, actually during the cell cycle, cells are constantly changing their genomes. And this is primarily what is actually contributing to genomic change, which is genetic variability, which would actually lead to the genetic divergence and divergence of life. So then it gets into the universals in biology and evolution. So this is important because conventional evolutionary theory asserts, that it's just a I got this backwards. That's funny. It's actually a random. It is a random walkthrough through adaptive space, like I mentioned earlier, and it also asserts that organisms are infinitely plastic assemblages. Basically, that there is no restriction on the modification that can happen to organisms. But as I mentioned earlier, there are constraints and internal and external constraints by the actual laws of physics and the laws of nature put onto organisms, which then only leave a few degrees of variability, not a few degrees, but leaves a certain finite amount of degrees of variability that organisms can go through. So they're not infinitely plastic assemblages. So, and there are some universals in biology. And the interesting thing about the universals in biology is that these are things that are unanimously present in all living systems, all organisms. And I put this table to the side here, some universals in biology. And thanks to modern molecular biology, we know about these things. So, for example, we have biochemical unity of life. They all have a metabolism. They all have genes. biological self-organization, assimilation of energy and matter into more biomass, growth, development, cellular organization of living matter, heredity, diversity, things of that sort, and the list goes on. And this is just the first table. Dr. James Shapiro in his paper here lists has another table listing some more universals in biology. And so it's also present in protein folds. And protein folds is another example. Proteins are genes code for proteins, and genes can have multiple functions. So they can produce multiple different various types of proteins. But what we actually understand now is that there's actually a finite menu of protein folds that can actually be actualized in nature. So protein folds don't actually evolve. They kind of are just actualized and realized in nature, and they are then coded for, and then they are used. So there's an article here called "The Protein Fold as Platonic Forms: New Support of the Pre-Darwinian Conception of Evolution by Natural Law," which is just more evidence for structuralism, as I said earlier. And if that's true, and we know that proteins are ultra important when it comes to evolution, then if there's a finite menu of protein folds that can be actualized and protein folds don't actually evolve, then that says that there is a particular direction in which things can evolve. And then here's another article supporting this view called "A Periodic Table of Protein Structures," basically saying that we can almost, see the finite menu of protein folds like we can see the periodic table of elements. There's a finite amount of total elements that the universe in its totality can actualize and realize in nature. And it's the same thing for protein folds and protein structures. So then we get into the non-randomness and evolution. And we have to understand that the common view is that evolution is entirely random. And if you were to rewind the tape of life, as Stephen Jay Gould said, you would not get what we see today. I disagree. I think that we would get something similar, but not exactly the same. And it's important to realize that the stressors and challenges are stochastic. It's usually equivocated with the word random, but I like to quibble on that. Stochastic is a more precise term, and it can actually be stochasticity in systems can actually be statistically modeled. But their changes and solutions are not. So what that means is that stressors and challenges is what organisms respond to, but the solutions they bring about are non-random in the sense that they tap into their natural genetic engineering functions, and they bring about the best solutions they can according to their situation. So the changes and solutions are not random. Cells harness stochasticity to bring about changes and solutions. So it's kind of like when you think about a slot machine, the famous slot machine at a casino, and you get 2 lemons, you need a third lemon, so you're going to keep pulling that lever until you get that third lemon. And it's kind of what cells do when they're trying to respond to situations. It's like, okay, what can I do to bring about the correct solutions? And cells have somewhat cognitive abilities. Now, I'm not saying that cells are conscious, but it's interesting, and this has perplexed many biologists who recognize this, such as Nobel Prize winner Barbara McClintock, who discovered transposable genetic elements in the genome, that she asked the famous question, what does the cell know about itself? Because cells do things and they produce things, and they respond to things that no human has ever produced themselves. Cells can communicate, they interpret information, they come up with solutions, and the way that they do these things involves millions and millions and millions and millions of types of molecules and chemicals and things to bring about these solutions and whatnot. So cells are not just dumb machines. In a way, I see them as microscopic quantum processors, actually. And we can talk about more about that later. And then we have niche construction. I just threw niche construction in there because niche construction basically says that instead of the environment as an external constraint um, determining kind of the way an organism evolves. Organisms are actually constantly and frequently changing their environments. They're actually adapting their own environments. And we see this, we have beavers in their dams. We have, there's just a list of ways that organisms are constant. I mean, humans, look what we've done. Look how we've affected the planet and the biosphere. So niche construction is also there too. So actually organisms in that way guide their own evolution by adapting their own environments to themselves and to their needs. And then we have some philosophical considerations. So given all the empirical data that I have presented, through the physical and biological entities here, governed by, laws, physical and biological entities are law governed. But we have to understand that if these processes and mechanisms are in the backs of physical law and the substances that are involved, we have to understand that laws only describe, they don't prescribe, and that is my philosophical position on laws. And if that's true, then we are examining the behavior of the relevant substances involved, i.e. the physical and biological entities. But physical and biological entities, if that's the thing, if their behavior is the thing that we are then examining, and they behave in a law-like fashion, periodic fashion, like I showed, even though biology, living systems are a dynamical process, they have universals, then that means that these substances have particular powers. And what I mean by powers is they have a particular, they have an ability to bring about a particular effect. Those are powers. So these substances have particular powers. For example, when certain molecular bonds happen, they can produce particular things of that sort. Nuclear fission and all that stuff can produce various elements and whatnot. They have particular powers. So given that, then I would ask, well, why do these things have the particular powers that they do? And then, so when you take into the fact that you also have the fine tuning, then what you have is right at the get-go, the initial state of the universe, you have particular substances that will behave a particular way, have certain powers to bring about certain things. And in that way, you have direction, and then you have teleology. And you have things functioning for particular purposes. And the way that we know that things are functioning for particular purposes is because we know what they are not doing when they are not functioning. And that's just teleology. If something is not functioning properly, well, we know what its function should be. That means it has a telos then. So I would say that the best and most coherent explanation as to why we see living systems behave the way that they do and go down the route the way that they do is because at the initial state, there is a foundational mind. There is intentionality. I would expect what we see through the empirical data that this aligns more with a foundational mind hypothesis about reality rather than a hypothesis about reality that starts with non-mind and intention and no intentions whatsoever, impersonal. That would be quite surprising on that hypothesis. So a hypothesis that includes a foundational mind, one with intentions, is actually not low, and it's more likely, it's more internally likely than one that is mindless. That one is, I would say, very, very low. So my conclusion would be that this best supports a foundational mind hypothesis about reality. So, yeah. That's what I got here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice. Yeah. Go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, I would love to kind of touch on what he said and kind of tie this together. So what's interesting is, at the quantum gravity, stage, we see quantum information processing, and then like I was saying, when the universe goes classical, we see the precision in the fundamental forces and the constants, like the ratio of the electron mass to the proton mass, ratio of electromagnetic force constant to gravitational force constant, the entropy level, and all of these things. And like Tim was saying, it shows a state of intentionality. And I can make a philosophical argument that intentional states are the product of mind. The fine tuning exhibits an intentional state or desired outcome. Therefore, the fine tuning is the product of mind. And what's interesting with process structuralism is the biological systems would come about due to the fine tuning. So, like he was saying, it's a state of intentionality, which would be the product of mind.
Right. Exactly. Because what we have to remember with the initial state is that the initial state has these parameters already present
Yeah.
at basically at the word go, and so the universe will unfold according to those parameters, and then what you get is a
Right.
universe in which it is includes all the things that I presented. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's what I was saying because that kind of ties into mind that it shows that information was input at the time of the Big Bang. Like you put in information to run a program, and that's what we have.
Exactly. And so what we see is um, it's interesting with the origin of life implications here because many are starting to see, okay, should we treat the origin of life as, okay, how do we get the first cell? Or should we treat the origin of life as how did we get to the point where a cell does what it does? Going back to Barbara McClintock's question, what does a cell know about itself? Because cells inherently have these natural genetic engineering functions. So in a way, built into the relevant substances that characterizes life, there is this kind of the show must go on type thing. And cells are able to construct, edit, architect their genomes to bring about solutions. And over the course of the 4 billion years of history we've been on Earth, look at the diversity of life that has occurred from that. That is very teleological because, like I said, every solution and the actual novelties and innovations come about through direction and not anything that is directionless, given what we talked about here. The biggest one is the origin of modern eukaryotes with the through symbiogenesis and an endosymbiosis event where two cells cooperated with one another. You had an oxygenated cell with a mitochondrion merged together, and that's what we see on our modern eukaryotes. So we have these mechanisms in which cells are able to cooperate, communicate, and the actual definition of a symbiont is something that if you were to rip the two cells apart, they couldn't survive without one another. And so what you have is the selection pressures that are actually selecting the symbiont, and then through the multicellular processes, we can get complex organisms and things of that sort. But yeah.
Yeah, I think John brought up a good point that kind of plays into this too as you were going through, and it might be like a couple slides after this one, but he asked, what does it mean for cells to have cognitive abilities but aren't conscious? I think that was that's a big part of your argument. Like, how are they able to do these things without consciousness like we see? And I guess, okay, so as I'm saying this, maybe I can kind of work this out and you can tell me where I'm wrong, but that kind of is evidence that okay, if they aren't conscious, then there must be some sort of consciousness behind fundamental to them or something like that. Is that kind of how that plays in? The fundamental mind that we're positing is what's the consciousness that is guiding them. Or maybe I could be off a little bit.
Sorry, I'm looking at this paper here, that describes this very well. Trying to find because it's gonna say it better than I can.
Yeah, that's fine. But
Okay,
yeah.
so I
Okay, go
found
ahead.
it. So there's actually an article called about cognition-based evolution, and it says that cognition-based evolution contends that biological variation is a product of self-reinforcing information cycle that derives from self-referential attachment to biological information space-time with its attendant ambiguities. The information cycle is embodied through obligatory linkages among energy, biological information, and communication. So so what you have is it's really interesting because this is honestly kind of right now a mystery within science, which is, you know, why does a cell kind of exhibit cognitive like behavior? And I'm not saying that they're conscious. I don't think that cells can introspect. I don't think cells can do those things. Um, but cells have these inherent abilities to interpret information, um, to communicate information, to respond to one another, work with one another, to bring about changes and solutions, and um, to maintain their situations in the midst of unpredictable thousands of unpredictable contingencies, while working with many of the molecules, macromolecules, and chemicals that are involved within living systems. So that's why I say that cells exhibit cognitive behavior, but they're not conscious.
That totally well. Hey, that definitely clears it up for sure. It's
They're,
uh,
think about artificial intelligence, because our phones, for example, if you were to send a text message, but you were to use, what is it, the keywords that it already suggests for you what it thinks you might type out, and you just, press the middle one, left one, and see what it does. It's going to be under algorithmic control, and it will send a message. It will create a message that sounds somewhat coherent, um, and but that's all algorithm. The interesting thing about cells is that you can actually create and introduce novel information through agency. So what I mean is, you can use the suggested keywords, but to deliver a particular novel message, you would have to go into your text message and start typing things yourself. And that's what cells do with their genomes. They are editing, they are splicing, and they are moving things around. So you can get novel information through agency. And this is the kind of the mystery in terms of origin of life, is like, why are cells capable of this? And so I have a book by Dennis Bray called Wetware. And it's called A Computer in Every Living Cell. And he actually has a chapter on cell awareness. So it's really interesting. I was reading it in preparation for this. So yeah, think about creation of novel information through agency. You have through a sonnet created by a poet, and then the same sonnet, but it came about through random processes, using the 26 alphabetical letters, for example. You can have the sonnet arrive through randomness, but it would be nothing new, because it's just using the information that already is. But a poet can introduce something that never existed before by way of agency. And so it kind of, if you think about intelligent design advocates, they're like, you need an input of new information. They're always talking about input of new information. It needs to be an intelligent designer. Well, what I'm saying is cells can do this. Cells are the ones creating the novel information. And the more we learn about the cell's abilities, the more mysteries we will be able to solve in terms of how innovations and novelties come about through this type of information. So, Travis, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Tim, I actually had a question for you. So, my argument is that, according to studies in, quantum mind, or, the universe is emergent from information processing, which is the product of mind. how do you see this tying into process structuralism? Because, according to quantum cognition, information processing in entangled states is the product of mind. The universe is emergent from information processing in an entangled state and would be the product of a foundational mind. And how do you see this, like, from a top-down approach going into process structuralism?
So yeah, so what I would say is my position on that would be that there's a foundational mind in which actualizes the blueprint of nature,
Right.
and how and basically there's teleology and teleological processes embedded in the fabric of space-time. And
Yes.
then what unfolds is according to that fabric. And within dynamical systems, there's indeterminacy. There's still indeterminacy involved in evolution. Like I said, there's stochasticity. But what you have is a subject, the cell, and which acts in a dynamical way according to the situations. So it's interesting because the universe is actualized with physical determinants leading up to the origin of life and things, and still playing a part in the various form structures and morphologies that come about. Like we can't.
Right. So,
Yeah.
oh no, I was going to say. So, would you agree with me that it kind of seems like at the initiation of the Big Bang, that there was like information or intelligence input into the fundamental forces in the physical constants and everything. So it seems like there was a high state of intentionality at the very beginning, and of course we know intentional states are the product of mind.
Yeah, it proceeds straight from intentional states.
Right. Yeah.
It proceeds straight from intentionality, and so all the natural things that play out proceed straight from that. So, like I was going to say, like we can't predict if an organism is going to produce a new novel structure like a limb or not. But what we do know is that there are the determinants from physics that play a role in actualizing those things alongside the evolutionary genetic mechanisms and processes that play that role as well. And this gets into, I didn't mention, but this gets into evolutionary developmental biology, which studies the role of development in evolution, biological development in evolution, and that there are actually ancient genes and proteins that are actually being used. They call actually a biologist named Sean Carroll calls it the developmental toolkit, in which organisms tap into to produce novel structures and things. And these are ancient. These are not new genes being developed. Right. These are genes being tapped into. And so then if you go back a step and you go, okay, then we look at the origin of life and how the first cell would have come about, how whether it's you start with an RNA world or a DNA world or whatnot. So you see very much this dynamical, deterministic play out of kind of how everything is already constructed prior, I would say.
And see, what I like about process structuralism is it ties right into the fine tuning. And so, like I know a good atheist objection is, well, maybe that's just the way, it just had to be that way. And what's interesting is we could grant that, because we could say that, if there's an intelligence that input information at the time of the Big Bang, and we're looking back at it now, then you could look at it as being deterministic, even though it actually wouldn't be.
Yeah. Sorry, hold on one second.
Yeah, I have something to say if you want to respond to that, but something that like John's been bringing up in the chat, and like I was kind of geez, I feel like I knew what I was gonna say as soon as I started to say it, like left my mind. But
that brain freeze, yeah.
Yeah. But whatchamacallit? So I can't read his comment, and then we'll go from there. But he said, he says, this is pretty confusing. Poets don't make new things. They're working with the materials that they have. So, yeah, that's kind of like what a lot of, like atheists, where when they respond to ID people, they'll say, well, this new information is not really new information. It's just like either a rearrangement, or you copy the ABC or whatever, you just do repeat it and switch it up. It's not necessarily like new. But are you saying that there is actually new information, like sort of like the ID people are onto something, they're just wrong, that it needs to be like inputted in from an outside source, like God has to do it right there, and it's done on its own or something like that? Is that kind of
Yeah,
what
no,
you're saying?
you're hitting on something really good. So to clarify there, what I'm talking about is novel information. I'm not talking about new information in the sense that I'm adding new letters to the alphabet. What I'm talking about is, I'm talking about something that is being realized that hasn't been realized before. So novel structures, for example, would be an example of that. Like an innovation would be antlers on deer and things, or on a moose or whatever. Hold on, one second.
You're
He's like, I gotta take this. I'll be back.
good.
I'm just kidding.
But yeah, I think this is a good point for sure. Like, what kind of the difference
Okay,
between
yeah.
novel and new?
So yeah,
Go
novel
ahead.
information is you have you have your information, but what I'm talking about is through agency. That is the only way in which you get novel things. For example, like I talked about with a sonnet. Um, a poet is able to break any periodic repetitive sequence that exists by um, looking at, like I talked about with the 26 letters of the alphabet, and organizing it in a way that hasn't been organized before. Rather, if it was just a random sequence, you might get stuff, you might get some interesting things, but you're not gonna the chance of actually getting novelty through that type of process um, is going to become actually very much repetitive, and you'll get kind of periodic sequences. But through something like agency, a poet is actually able to break the order and introduce actually a new order that hasn't been actualized before, in that sense. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's novel information. So innovations and novel information, as the evolution, the extended synthesis talks about, um, comes about through interactions through cells
Mhm.
based upon particular situations. That's why I mentioned, text messaging on your phone. It's like, someone might respond to you and say, "Hey, um, what was the answer to this particular homework question?" And through the algorithms that are within your phone, you can't just randomly respond to that. It's not going to give the correct or response to the particular situation. But through agency, you can organize information in such a way that can bring about new order and respond to that correctly. So this kind of gets into, the genome as being a dynamic information storage organelle that can always be written and rewritten. And this actually goes into junk DNA, and the whole idea about junk DNA, that, majority of the genome doesn't actually code for proteins. But those parts of the genome, as Dr. James Shapiro actually points out, are actually very useful, because those non-coding DNA sequences and those repetitive DNA sequences are actually there for the cell to actually make use of in particular situations, and they're there for, like, providing foundations for like chromatin structures, which actually compose chromosomes and things of that sort. So just because we have repetitive sequences of non-coding DNA doesn't mean that it's actually useless, because if you look at the genome as an information storage organelle, then it's just stored information that the cell can actually use. And that's kind of where I'm talking about the agency, the cognitive ability. Cells can use this for a given situation. And that's what makes people think, okay, do cells have abilities similar to cognition. They're not conscious. No one's really saying that cells are conscious. They don't have self-awareness in those types of experiences, but they do behave in such a way in which they can communicate, process information, problem solve, etc., which is, what we see with organisms that have cognition. So,
Yeah.
Right. And
Something. Oh, go ahead.
what's really interesting is, like, as idealists, we can say that what would differentiate us with, like, intelligent design proponents is that we would say that God works through the natural laws of physics. He doesn't have to work within them. He works through them.
yeah.
Yeah, something I was kind of thinking as you were using like the text message analogy. I think that's kind of good. And maybe, but like, so you said like random buttons are not going to necessarily get the right answer, but I wouldn't say, and I'm sure you wouldn't either, that there's like a philosophical like contradiction. Like there's no like inherent reason why it couldn't randomly get the right answer. Like, I mean, I know that seems very unlikely, but that's kind of, but I don't think that's what you're saying. And I almost think maybe a better analogy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but would be like your phone autocorrect is never going to use a new proper name or something that you've never used before. It's not going to know something like that. That's like impossible. You know what I mean? Like if it's a person you've never met before, never texted, and they had a name that's never been used before, your phone doesn't have it in there to use. So how can that come out? So maybe that, I don't know. Like, I mean, I think that's along the
Yeah,
same
that's what I mean is by
sure.
it's under algorithmic control, but if you want to introduce novelty into the system, the best way to do that is through some form of, like I mentioned, agency
Yeah,
of
and I
that
know.
sort.
Yeah, and John actually asked like this term agency or whatever because you use it a lot, and I mean I think we all kind of like have an idea of what that means, but I think it's one of those terms too that could be like everyone has an idea, but that's like could lead to like people talking past
So
each
yeah,
other.
so I'm keeping these terms loose when I'm talking about cells, because when I'm talking about, of course, when I'm talking about text messages, when I mean agency in that context, I'm talking about, conscious agency that we all have here. Um, and but what I'm talking about on the level of cells is cells possess something that looks very similar to that, which is why I mentioned the article about cognition based evolution, um, that um, that there is cognitive like behaviors such as information processing, interpretation, and problem solving that cells possess. So if I were to use agency loosely in that way, I'm just talking about kind of these abilities that these cognitive abilities that these cells exhibit.
Right. You're
But
not talking like panpsychism or anything like that.
no, yeah, no consciousness, no self-awareness. But it's like, what do you do when you see that empirically shown that a cell can process information and come up with solutions that have never been actualized before based upon that information? What are they? Are they dumb machines? Are they intelligent machines? What are they? So I'm leaving that up to the origin of life people. But that's what I mean when I use cognition / agency in the cellular sense versus in the human person's sense, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. And then he has a really good question too that I think is like a really good towards the end here as we're getting there. But he's like, putting on my pastor hat, why should I care about all this concerning what it means to be a Christian in my everyday life? So yeah, so I think that's like a definitely a good thing to think about as we do these arguments. Like what's I mean, is it just, you know what I mean? I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Okay, so I'll go ahead and start. I would make the argument that, if you take my argument that, according to quantum cognition, information processing in entangled states is the product of mind. The universe emerges from information processing in an entangled state. Therefore, the universe is the product of mind, and this mind is who we call God. To put it on your Christian hat, we would say that, the universe is created by God, and we are made in God's image, and that everything in the universe is under the control of God, even biological systems.
Yeah, for me, when I started studying all this stuff, and I covered not even scratching the surface is what I covered. Um, I didn't even list. There's so much more evidence I could have gone over, but through the studying of this evidence, it actually gave me a higher view of God in this sense, and it actually made me look at the world and actually give more reverence to what has been created, because it is much. There's more. It's deeper than what we think and what we see. And honestly, I would say that we only understand probably around like 5% of how all this stuff in biology actually works. And we're going to keep uncovering. And we don't know how deep nature's toolbox goes. And that toolbox is there because it has been intentionally put there. It's been intentionally actualized like that. And so for me, it's just giving me a more grand picture of the world, and then thus giving me more majesty to the creator.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's kind of what I was thinking as you're going through this. It's like a lot of, I think a big thing, like even a more simplified way of thinking about this, not like simplified, but whatever. I'm just, is a lot of people think like, oh, studying, I mean, you can get down to the really simple, like studying science is like a bad thing for Christians, or we should be afraid of it because it's going to just like rule God out or whatever. And like you can clearly see in this argument that that is not at all. Like it is just, as we dive into this, we just see that there's just so much more than we have anywhere near the idea to like comprehend, and it just, like you said, it points to like so much grander view of reality as you keep looking into these things. It's just deeper and deeper and deeper, but it also like makes sense in a way that we can kind of understand. And that's what, like one thing, like even though like we only comprehend so little, like the idea that we can even comprehend and like look into these like super deep levels is part that shows me that like our our intelligence or our like perception of reality is somehow tied into the foundation or created by the foundation, whatever, however it ends up working. Like I said, I'm not have my view necessarily nailed down enough, but like it seems like if evolution was just this random process, all of a sudden like consciousness popped up, there'd be no way that we could even like introspect at all into these like foundations. It would all seem to like constantly be breaking down, and we would be like completely changing our views. And it seems like our understanding is just growing and growing. It's not like it that just like, I mean, obviously
Yeah.
there's big points where our understanding changes, but it's not like all of a sudden we realize like these people had no freaking clue. Like it's really
No,
interesting as we build on
Hmm.
top of each other's like understanding.
and another thing, in answer to John's question is, I didn't believe in God. Okay, I didn't think he was, I was an atheist. But what really opened the door for me was Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe, and seeing like these scientific evidences of, and intelligence and intentionality is what led me to believe in God and become a Christian. So, I mean, I actually became a Christian through science. Interestingly.
Yeah, and just this whole idea that, and I'm reading here from Shapiro's paper. He literally says that cells compute and make decision. The idea that cells compute and make decisions is not new, but his widespread acceptance has only recently emerged from studies of biological regulation and the identification of countless molecules, multimolecular complexes, and signaling systems, which provide detailed control over the operation of virtually every aspect of cellular functions. That makes the most sense if the foundations of reality is a mind. That is extremely unexpected on a mindless foundation hypothesis about reality. And then through those mechanisms and processes, you know, the appearance of conscious moral agents like ourselves can finally come about. And that means that the foundation, if the foundation is mind, then it has the resources to produce um, creatures such as ourselves. It can actualize, it can initiate the chain, the causal chain that leads up to us because it has the resources to do so. That's why I say it's a more internally likely hypothesis if you contrast it against one that doesn't include mind in the foundation. So, yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think we covered a lot in this. Man, that presentation was awesome. I'm just like thinking back through.
It
There was
was,
so
yeah.
much there, for sure. That
Wait,
I
whose presentation?
think
Wait, mine or
yours.
what was
Yeah,
ours? Oh, okay.
yours. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just like thinking back through all the things you said. There was just a ton there.
Thanks,
I
man.
know. Yeah, and don't see too many more like specific questions. John's just in here crying about it's too abstract or something, but he can. No, I'm just kidding. But it's a. I mean, I think things like this too. Like a big thing though, as I think about it, it's. I mean, it's not for everybody. Like, this is clearly not the only way that you can come to know God or anything like that. That's not at all what we're trying to say. It's just like one way of people who look at biology, and biology is not, or or like the foundation of reality. Like, this is not some like thing that has no evidence for God and like it completely turns us away or anything. Like, we look there, we see it. We look here, we see God. We look there, we see God. We look in theology, we see God. You know, like all these things all point to God, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at here is that
Right. And
yeah,
see, what's interesting is, like, when I started with like quantum gravity to the emergence of space time, to the precision and the fundamental forces, to the the teleology involved, and then like with the extensive amount of biology that Tim covered. I mean, we see evidence of God in everything.
Yeah. And I was gonna respond. I mean, it's interesting. I'm looking at the Apocalypse here.